The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the Palazzo della Signoria as Lorenzo de' Medici paced restlessly before the great windows overlooking Florence. His face, usually composed in the manner befitting one of the most powerful men in Italy, betrayed an unusual anxiety. In his hand, he clutched a letter, crumpled from repeated reading, that had arrived at dawn from a rival banking house in Venice. "They mock me, Niccolò," Lorenzo said without turning from the window. "They question my judgment, my authority, my very right to negotiate terms with them. And here I stand, composing response after response, explaining myself like a schoolboy called before his master." Niccolò Machiavelli, then, a young observer in the Medici court, watched his patron with keen interest. At 25, Machiavelli had already witnessed the rise and fall of numerous powerful men, and he recognized in Lorenzo's agitation the seeds of potential downfall. The older man was displaying what Machiavelli would later identify as the three cardinal sins of leadership: chasing approval, begging for understanding, and explaining oneself to those who had already made their judgment. "My lord," Machiavelli said quietly, setting down his quill, "may I suggest that the very act of responding to their provocations has already given them what they seek?" Lorenzo turned sharply. "And what is that?" "Your attention. Your emotional investment. Your acknowledgement that their opinion holds power over you." Machiavelli rose from his desk and approached the window. "In seeking to defend yourself, you have inadvertently validated their attack. You have made yourself the supplicant in a game where you should be the sovereign." This conversation, though likely apocryphal, captures the essence of a philosophy that Machiavelli would spend his lifetime developing and refining. It was not merely about political maneuvering or military strategy, though these were certainly components. It was about something far more fundamental: the architecture of personal power and the psychological foundations upon which all authority rests. The principle that the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others would become central to Machiavelli's understanding of human nature and the mechanics of dominance. It was not enough to acquire power, one had to forge oneself into the kind of person who could hold it. This required a systematic dismantling of those aspects of the self that made one vulnerable to manipulation, control, and defeat. In the months that followed that morning conversation, Machiavelli began to observe more carefully the behavioral patterns of those who succeeded in maintaining their position and those who inevitably fell. He noticed that failure often came not from external enemies, though these certainly existed, but from internal weaknesses that enemies could exploit. The most dangerous vulnerabilities were those that appeared virtuous on the surface: the desire to be liked, the need to be understood, the compulsion to justify one's actions to others. Lorenzo's situation with the Venetian bankers provided an illuminating case study. The more he attempted to explain his position, the more he appeared defensive. The more he sought their approval, the more power he handed them over his emotional state. The more he chased their acknowledgement, the more elusive it became. He had fallen into what Machiavelli would later term the supplicant's trap, the belief that earnest explanation and persistent pursuit could overcome resistance and hostility. But human nature, as Machiavelli understood it, operated according to different principles entirely. People were more likely to respect what they could not easily obtain than what was freely offered. They valued most highly those who appeared to need them least. They followed leaders who projected certainty and self-sufficiency rather than those who sought validation and understanding. The solution, Machiavelli realized, was not to become cruel or indifferent, but to become psychologically self-contained. A leader, indeed, any person seeking to maintain their position and dignity, must learn to generate their own sense of worth rather than seeking it from external sources. They must become comfortable with being misunderstood rather than constantly explaining themselves. They must learn to withdraw their attention and energy from those who did not appreciate it rather than pursuing ever more desperately. This philosophy extended far beyond the political realm. Machiavelli observed the same patterns in personal relationships, business dealings, and social interactions. Those who chased romantic partners inevitably repelled them. Those who begged for professional recognition rarely received it. Those who constantly explained their decisions appeared weak and uncertain. Conversely, those who maintained their dignity, who could walk away from situations that did not serve them, who did not need others' approval to feel secure in themselves, these individuals commanded respect almost effortlessly. The transformation required was not merely behavioral but psychological. It demanded a fundamental reorientation of one's relationship to others and to oneself. Instead of seeking validation from the external world, one had to learn to generate it internally. Instead of fearing rejection or misunderstanding, one had to become comfortable with the possibility that not everyone would approve or comprehend. Instead of believing that persistent effort could overcome any obstacle, one had to accept that some battles were not worth fighting and some people were not worth pursuing. As Machiavelli continued his observations, he began to identify the specific mechanisms by which weak behaviors undermined one's position. When Lorenzo repeatedly explained himself to the Venetian bankers, he was implicitly acknowledging that they had the right to judge him. When he chased their approval, he was positioning himself as the inferior party. When he begged for their understanding, he was demonstrating that his emotional well-being depended on their response. Each of these behaviors, while appearing reasonable or even virtuous, actually eroded Lorenzo's power base. They signaled to observers that he was not self-sufficient, that he could be manipulated through emotional pressure, that his confidence could be shaken by criticism or withdrawal of approval. In essence, they advertised his vulnerabilities to anyone who might wish to exploit them. The alternative approach that Machiavelli began to formulate required a complete inversion of these tendencies. Instead of explaining, one should act with quiet confidence and let results speak for themselves. Instead of chasing, one should focus one's energy on worthy pursuits and worthy people while remaining indifferent to those who did not reciprocate interest or respect. Instead of begging for understanding, one should accept that being misunderstood was often the price of independence and strength. This philosophy was not about becoming cold or callous, though it might sometimes appear so to those accustomed to more suppliant behavior. Rather, it was about developing what Machiavelli would later call virtue, not virtue in the conventional moral sense, but the combination of strength, skill, and psychological resilience that allowed one to navigate the complexities of human relationships without losing oneself in the process. The development of such virtue required systematic practice. It meant learning to tolerate the discomfort of being misunderstood without rushing to correct misperceptions. It meant recognizing that one's own approval was more important than the approval of others. It meant understanding that true strength often appeared as indifference to those who mistook emotional reactivity for caring. As winter settled over Florence, Machiavelli watched Lorenzo gradually implement some of these principles in his dealings with the Venetian bankers. Instead of lengthy explanations, Lorenzo began offering brief, clear statements of his position. Instead of pursuing their approval, he focused on negotiations that served his interests regardless of their opinion of him. Instead of begging for their understanding, he proceeded with his plans while remaining open to mutually beneficial arrangements but not dependent on them. The results were immediately apparent. The Venetians, who had grown accustomed to Lorenzo's defensive responses, were suddenly dealing with a different person entirely. His newfound indifference to their opinion paradoxically increased their respect for him. His unwillingness to chase their approval made them more interested in maintaining the relationship. His refusal to explain himself forced them to take his positions seriously rather than dismissing them as the desperate pleading of an inferior. This transformation in Lorenzo's approach provided Machiavelli with crucial insights into the nature of human psychology and the dynamics of power. He began to understand that most people operated from positions of fundamental insecurity and that they unconsciously tested others to determine who could be controlled and who could not. Those who responded to such tests with explanation, pursuit, or pleading immediately marked themselves as controllable. Those who remained unmoved and self-directed earned a different kind of treatment entirely. The implications of this understanding extended far beyond individual interactions. Machiavelli began to see how entire nations could be understood through similar psychological frameworks. Countries that constantly explained their actions to international audiences, that chased the approval of other powers, or that begged for understanding in the face of criticism often found themselves in progressively weaker positions. Those that acted from their own interests with quiet confidence, that did not depend on others' approval for their sense of legitimacy, and that remained indifferent to misunderstanding when their vital interests were at stake, these nations commanded respect and maintained their sovereignty. Part 1. The Architecture of Weakness. Understanding the Supplicant's Trap. The concept that would later revolutionize Machiavelli's approach to human dynamics first revealed itself during the harsh winter of 1494, when French troops under Charles VIII descended upon the Italian peninsula like a plague of locusts. Machiavelli, then, serving as a junior secretary in the Florentine chancery, found himself witness to a series of diplomatic encounters that would forever alter his understanding of power, weakness, and human nature. The Duke of Milan, Ludovico Sforza, had invited the French invasion as a means of securing his own position against rival claimants. Yet as the French armies swept through northern Italy with devastating efficiency, Sforza found himself in the peculiar position of having to explain and justify his decision to increasingly skeptical allies. Day after day, Machiavelli observed as the Duke dispatched envoy after envoy to various Italian courts, each bearing elaborate explanations of his strategic reasoning, each more desperate than the last. "See how he diminishes himself with every explanation," remarked Francesco Valori, the Florentine politician, as they watched yet another Milanese delegation depart for Naples. "Each justification makes him appear less like a sovereign who has made a calculated decision and more like a child who has broken something valuable and hopes to avoid punishment." Machiavelli nodded, but his mind was working on a deeper level. He was beginning to recognize a pattern that extended far beyond this particular diplomatic crisis. There was something fundamentally weakening about the act of explanation when it came from a position of defensive necessity rather than educational generosity. When Sforza explained his alliance with France to other Italian powers, he was implicitly acknowledging that they had the right to judge his decisions. More importantly, he was revealing that their disapproval could affect his emotional equilibrium and, potentially, his future actions. This revelation led Machiavelli to examine more closely the behavioral patterns of individuals in various positions of power and influence. He began to notice that those who felt compelled to explain themselves extensively were often those whose authority was already in question. Secure leaders, by contrast, acted with a kind of sovereign indifference to others' understanding of their motives. They might share information when it served their purposes, but they did not seem psychologically dependent on others' comprehension or approval. The distinction was subtle but crucial. There was a vast difference between choosing to explain something because it served one's interests and feeling compelled to explain because one could not tolerate being misunderstood. The former demonstrated confidence and strategic thinking, the latter revealed insecurity and emotional dependence. People, Machiavelli observed, had an almost supernatural ability to detect this difference, even when they could not articulate it consciously. During the spring of 1495, as the political situation in Italy continued to deteriorate, Machiavelli had occasion to observe this dynamic playing out in more intimate settings. He was tasked with accompanying a Florentine embassy to the court of Pope Alexander VI, where he witnessed a fascinating interaction between the Pope and Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere, who would later become Pope Julius II. Della Rovere had been openly critical of Alexander's policies and personal conduct, accusations that had spread throughout the ecclesiastical hierarchy and were causing considerable embarrassment to the papal court. Rather than ignore these criticisms or respond with the kind of detailed refutations that lesser men might have employed, Alexander chose a different approach entirely. When Della Rovere's accusations were brought to his attention during a public audience, the Pope simply smiled and remarked, "His Eminence's concerns are noted," before turning his attention to other matters. The effect was extraordinary. Della Rovere, who had clearly expected to provoke a defensive response that would further damage Alexander's reputation, found himself in the position of having made serious accusations that were neither denied nor acknowledged. The Pope's refusal to engage with the substance of the criticisms somehow made them appear less significant than if he had mounted an elaborate defense. By declining to play the role of defendant, Alexander had refused to validate the premise that Della Rovere had the right to prosecute him in the first place. Machiavelli filed this observation away with growing excitement. He was beginning to understand that many conflicts were won or lost not through superior arguments or greater resources, but through the psychological positioning of the parties involved. Those who allowed themselves to be cast in the role of defendant, who accepted the premise that they needed to justify themselves to others, had already lost a crucial battle before the substantive issues were even addressed. This principle applied with equal force to personal relationships, business negotiations, and social interactions. Machiavelli began to pay closer attention to the dynamics between individuals in various contexts, and he consistently found the same patterns. Those who chased after others' approval, who begged for understanding, who constantly explained their actions and motivations, these individuals, regardless of their other qualities, consistently found themselves in subordinate positions. The mechanism by which this occurred was both subtle and devastating. When person A repeatedly pursued person B's approval, A was implicitly communicating that B's opinion was more important than A's own self-assessment. When A begged for B's understanding, A was suggesting that A's emotional well-being was dependent on B's comprehension and acceptance. When A constantly explained A's actions to B, A was positioning B as the judge of A's behavior. Each of these communications, while perhaps intended to improve the relationship or resolve conflicts, actually eroded A's position relative to B. They established a psychological hierarchy in which B's thoughts and feelings mattered more than A's, in which B had the power to grant or withhold emotional rewards, in which B was the sovereign and A the supplicant. Once this dynamic was established, it became increasingly difficult to reverse. B, whether consciously or unconsciously, would begin to expect this deference from A. Any attempt by A to establish more equal footing would be met with resistance or even punishment. B had become accustomed to being pursued, understood, and explained to, and would not easily relinquish this advantageous position. Machiavelli observed this pattern playing out with tragic regularity in the court life of Florence. Young courtiers who were overeager to please inevitably found themselves marginalized and disrespected. Merchants who chased difficult customers with ever more attractive terms often found themselves taken advantage of rather than appreciated. Even in romantic contexts, those who pursued too ardently were often spurned in favor of those who maintained a certain dignified reserve. The solution, as Machiavelli began to formulate it, required a fundamental reorientation of one's approach to relationships and interactions. Instead of seeking to be understood, one had to become comfortable with being misunderstood. Instead of chasing approval, one had to learn to generate one's own sense of worth. Instead of explaining oneself constantly, one had to develop the confidence to act according to one's own judgment and let others draw their own conclusions. This transformation was not merely a matter of changing one's behavior, it required a deep psychological shift in how one understood oneself in relation to others. The person who had truly internalized these principles would not feel compelled to explain themselves because they would not be dependent on others' understanding for their sense of self-worth. They would not chase approval because their own approval would be sufficient. They would not beg for understanding because they would be at peace with the possibility that some people would never comprehend their perspective. Such a person, Machiavelli realized, would be almost impossible to manipulate or control through conventional means. They could not be threatened with disapproval because they did not depend on others' approval. They could not be manipulated through withdrawal of attention because they were not addicted to others' attention. They could not be controlled through criticism or misunderstanding because they were comfortable with both. The development of this psychological independence was not easy, and Machiavelli observed that most people never achieved it fully. The desire to be liked, understood, and approved of appeared to be deeply rooted in human nature, perhaps because these things had been necessary for survival in earlier stages of human development. But, in the complex social and political environments of Renaissance Italy, these same instincts had become sources of vulnerability rather than strength. As Machiavelli continued his observations and reflections, he began to identify specific practices and mental disciplines that could help individuals develop greater psychological independence. The first and, perhaps most important, was learning to tolerate discomfort, specifically, the discomfort of being disliked, misunderstood, or criticized without immediately rushing to correct these situations. Most people, when faced with disapproval or misunderstanding, experienced a kind of psychological urgency that compelled them to take immediate action to restore harmony. This urgency was the root of supplicant behavior. It led people to chase after those who withdrew from them, to explain themselves to those who criticized them, and to beg for understanding from those who seemed unwilling to provide it. Learning to sit with this discomfort without reacting was like developing a muscle. Initially, it was almost unbearable. The urge to explain, to pursue, to beg for understanding could be overwhelming. But, with practice, one could learn to tolerate these feelings without acting on them. One could learn to let others think what they would, to allow misunderstandings to persist, to remain calm in the face of disapproval or criticism. This tolerance for discomfort was the foundation upon which all other aspects of psychological strength were built. Once a person could remain centered in the face of others' negative reactions, they were free to make decisions based on their own judgment rather than their fear of others' responses. They could act according to their own values rather than constantly adjusting their behavior to maintain others' approval. The second crucial element was developing what Machiavelli came to think of as sovereign indifference, not coldness or callousness, but a kind of benevolent detachment from others' opinions and reactions. This did not mean becoming insensitive to feedback or closed to new information, but rather maintaining one's own emotional equilibrium regardless of how others chose to respond. Sovereign indifference allowed one to interact with others from a position of strength rather than need. When one was not dependent on others' approval or understanding, one could offer genuine care and attention without the desperate undertone that characterized supplicant behavior. Paradoxically, this made one more attractive and influential, not less, because people were naturally drawn to those who appeared complete and self-sufficient rather than needy and dependent. Throughout his observations of court life, diplomatic negotiations, and personal relationships, Machiavelli noted that those who had developed these qualities seemed to operate in a different psychological universe from those who had not. They moved through conflicts and challenges with a kind of serene confidence that was both admirable and effective. They did not waste energy on futile pursuits or emotional reactions. They focused their attention and resources on what truly mattered to them rather than being constantly distracted by the need to manage others' perceptions. Most importantly, they were difficult to manipulate or control. Their strength came not from their ability to dominate others, but from their independence from others' ability to dominate them. They had achieved what Machiavelli would later recognize as the ultimate form of power, sovereignty over oneself. Part 2, The Forge of Transformation, Destroying the Weak Self. The winter of 1503 brought devastating floods to the Arno Valley, and, with them, a crisis that would test everything Machiavelli had learned about human nature and the psychology of power. The floods had destroyed much of the grain harvest, and Florence found itself dependent on imports from neighboring territories to feed its population. This created an opportunity for the city's enemies to exert pressure through economic manipulation, and it fell to Machiavelli, now in a more senior position within the chancery, to negotiate with various suppliers and potential allies. Among the most crucial negotiations were those with Cesare Borgia, the ambitious son of Pope Alexander VI, who controlled significant grain-producing territories in the Romagna. Borgia had a reputation for ruthlessness, but also for his ability to identify and exploit weakness in others. As Machiavelli prepared for these negotiations, he realized that this would be a practical test of the principles he had been developing over the past several years. The old Machiavelli, the one who had watched Lorenzo de' Medici explain himself repeatedly to Venetian bankers, might have approached Borgia with elaborate justifications for Florence's position, detailed explanations of the city's needs, and perhaps even appeals to Borgia's compassion for the suffering of innocent civilians. But the man who walked into Borgia's camp that cold January morning was fundamentally different. He had spent years systematically identifying and destroying those aspects of himself that made him vulnerable to manipulation and control. The process had not been easy. Like most people, Machiavelli had initially been uncomfortable with the idea of being misunderstood or disliked. His natural inclination had been to explain himself when criticized, to pursue those who withdrew from him, and to seek approval from those whose opinions seemed important. But experience had taught him that these very behaviors were the source of his weakness, not his strength. The transformation had begun with small, private exercises in self-discipline. When criticized, either fairly or unfairly, Machiavelli practiced remaining silent rather than immediately defending himself. When someone withdrew their attention or approval, he focused on other relationships and activities rather than pursuing them. When he felt the urge to explain his decisions or actions, he instead asked himself whether the explanation would serve any practical purpose or merely satisfy his own need to be understood. Each of these exercises was uncomfortable initially. The urge to react, to explain, to pursue was often overwhelming. But, gradually, through repeated practice, Machiavelli developed what he came to think of as psychological calluses, areas of his psyche that had become toughened through exposure to discomfort and were no longer sensitive to the kinds of social pressures that controlled most people. This internal transformation manifested in subtle but significant changes in how others responded to him. colleagues who had previously felt free to criticize or dismiss his ideas began to treat him with greater respect. People who had once expected detailed explanations of his decisions learned to accept his judgment without question. Those who had previously been able to manipulate him through emotional pressure found that their tactics no longer worked. The change was not that Machiavelli had become cold or indifferent to others, but rather that he had become self-sufficient in ways that made him less dependent on their responses. He could offer genuine warmth and attention when it was appropriate, but he did not need constant validation or understanding to maintain his emotional equilibrium. This independence made him paradoxically more attractive to others, not less, because people were naturally drawn to those who appeared complete and self-contained. As Machiavelli faced Cesare Borgia across a table laden with maps and grain inventories, he drew upon all of these hard-won insights. Borgia began the negotiations, as expected, with various psychological probes designed to identify weakness and establish dominance. He made disparaging comments about Florence's predicament, questioned Machiavelli's authority to negotiate on the city's behalf, and suggested that perhaps Florence should consider subordinating itself to papal authority in exchange for assistance. The old Machiavelli would have responded to each of these provocations, explaining Florence's strength, defending his credentials, and rejecting the suggestion of subordination with detailed arguments about the city's independence and sovereignty. But this Machiavelli simply listened with calm attention, neither agreeing nor disagreeing, neither defending nor attacking. When Borgia finished his opening gambit, Machiavelli responded with a simple statement of Florence's position: they were prepared to pay fair market prices for grain and could offer certain political considerations in return, but only within the framework of mutually beneficial arrangements between equals. The effect on Borgia was immediately apparent. Accustomed to dealing with negotiators who either cowered before his reputation or postured defensively in response to his provocations, he found himself facing someone who seemed genuinely indifferent to his attempts at intimidation. Machiavelli's refusal to play the expected role of either supplicant or adversary forced Borgia to recalibrate his approach entirely. As the negotiations continued over several days, Machiavelli observed how his psychological transformation affected not only his interactions with Borgia but also his ability to think clearly and strategically. Because he was not constantly worried about how others perceived him, he could focus entirely on the substance of the discussions. Because he was not emotionally reactive to Borgia's various attempts at manipulation, he could observe them objectively and respond only to those elements that served Florence's interests. Most importantly, because he was not dependent on Borgia's approval or cooperation for his sense of self-worth, he was genuinely prepared to walk away from the negotiations if they did not produce acceptable terms. This readiness to withdraw, not as a bluff or negotiating tactic, but as a genuine willingness to accept that outcome, gave him tremendous power in the discussions. Borgia, who was accustomed to dealing with people who needed something from him more than he needed something from them, found himself in the unusual position of working to maintain Machiavelli's interest in the arrangement. The negotiations ultimately concluded successfully for Florence, but the real victory for Machiavelli was the validation of his evolving philosophy. He had not succeeded through superior arguments, greater resources, or more skillful tactics, but through a fundamental transformation in his relationship to the negotiation itself. By destroying those aspects of himself that made him vulnerable to manipulation, his need for approval, his compulsion to explain and justify himself, his fear of being disliked or misunderstood, he had made himself genuinely powerful in ways that could not be easily countered. This experience led Machiavelli to develop a more systematic understanding of what he called the forge of transformation, the process by which individuals could identify and eliminate their psychological weaknesses. The metaphor of the forge was deliberate. Just as metal must be heated and hammered to remove impurities and achieve strength, the human psyche must be subjected to controlled stress and discipline to eliminate those elements that made it vulnerable to external manipulation. The first stage of this process was recognition, the ability to identify one's own patterns of weak behavior. This was often more difficult than it appeared, because such behaviors were typically rationalized as virtues. The person who constantly explained themselves might think they were being communicative and transparent. The person who chased others' approval might believe they were being considerate and relationship-focused. The person who begged for understanding might assume they were being open and emotionally honest. But Machiavelli had learned to evaluate behaviors not by their apparent virtue but by their practical effects. Did the behavior increase or decrease one's power and autonomy? Did it make others more or less likely to respect and value one's position? Did it create dependence on external validation or foster internal strength and self-sufficiency? These were the questions that mattered, not whether the behavior conformed to conventional notions of virtue or propriety. The second stage was controlled exposure, deliberately placing oneself in situations where the weak behaviors would be triggered, and, then, practicing alternative responses. Just as soldiers trained for battle by practicing in controlled conditions that simulated the stress and chaos of actual combat, individuals seeking psychological strength had to practice new behaviors in situations that triggered their old patterns of weakness. For someone who habitually explained themselves when criticized, this might mean accepting criticism without response and learning to tolerate the discomfort of being potentially misunderstood. For someone who chased others' approval, it might mean focusing attention and energy on their own projects and interests while remaining friendly but indifferent to others' reactions. For someone who begged for understanding, it might mean stating their position once clearly and, then, allowing others to comprehend or not as they chose. The third stage was integration, the point at which new behaviors became natural rather than forced. This required patience and persistence, because ingrained psychological patterns did not change overnight. But, gradually, through consistent practice, individuals could develop genuine comfort with behaviors that had initially felt foreign or uncomfortable. They could learn to be authentically indifferent to others' approval rather than merely pretending indifference. They could develop real comfort with being misunderstood rather than simply enduring it as a necessary evil. Machiavelli observed that those who successfully completed this transformation seemed to undergo a fundamental shift in their relationship to the world around them. They moved from a position of psychological dependence to one of psychological sovereignty. They no longer needed constant validation from others to feel secure in themselves. They were no longer controlled by fear of disapproval or criticism. They had achieved a kind of internal freedom that made external freedom much more likely. This internal transformation was not about becoming indifferent to all relationships or feedback, but about developing the ability to choose one's responses rather than being controlled by emotional reactions. A psychologically sovereign person could still value close relationships, seek advice, and be influenced by others' perspectives, but they did so from a position of choice rather than compulsion. They engaged with others because they found it valuable or enjoyable, not because they needed others' validation to feel complete. The practical implications of this transformation were enormous. In negotiations, such individuals could not be manipulated through emotional pressure or threats to withdraw approval. In personal relationships, they could not be controlled through guilt, manipulation, or emotional blackmail. In professional settings, they could not be undermined through criticism or attempts to isolate them socially. Perhaps most importantly, they could not be destroyed by others because they had already destroyed those aspects of themselves that made destruction possible. Their sense of worth was internally generated rather than externally dependent. Their emotional equilibrium was self-maintaining rather than contingent on others' responses. Their confidence was based on their own assessment of their capabilities rather than on others' recognition of those capabilities. As Machiavelli refined his understanding of these principles through continued observation and practice, he began to see their application in broader contexts. Nations, organizations, and institutions could also be understood as either psychologically dependent or psychologically sovereign. Those that constantly explained themselves to critics, that chased international approval, or that begged for understanding from hostile powers inevitably found themselves in subordinate positions. Those that acted from their own interests with quiet confidence, that did not depend on others' approval for their sense of legitimacy, and that remained indifferent to misunderstanding when their vital interests were at stake commanded respect and maintained their autonomy. The forge of transformation was not a one-time process but a continuous discipline. Just as physical strength required ongoing exercise to maintain, psychological sovereignty required constant vigilance against the natural human tendencies toward dependence and external validation. But, for those willing to undertake this discipline, the rewards were immense, a kind of personal power that could not be taken away, a freedom that did not depend on circumstances, and a strength that grew more formidable the more it was tested. In his later writings, Machiavelli would distill these insights into principles that could guide both individuals and states in their pursuit of genuine autonomy. But, the foundation of all these principles remained the same, the recognition that true strength came not from the ability to control others, but from the elimination of others' ability to control oneself. The man who destroyed his weak self, who eliminated his dependence on external validation, his compulsion to explain and justify himself, and his need to chase others' approval, had achieved a form of invulnerability that no external enemy could breach. This was not the invulnerability of physical armor or superior weaponry, but something far more profound, the invulnerability of complete psychological self-sufficiency. Such a person might face external challenges, criticism, or even hostility, but none of these things could fundamentally disturb their inner equilibrium or compromise their ability to act according to their own judgment. They had achieved what Machiavelli would later recognize as the highest form of power, mastery over themselves. Part 3, The Sovereign Self, Mastery Through Indifference. The autumn of 1512 brought the collapse of everything Machiavelli had worked to build. The Medici returned to Florence with Spanish backing, the Republican government fell, and Machiavelli found himself not only dismissed from his position but suspected of conspiracy against the new regime. Imprisoned in the Bargello, subjected to interrogation and torture, stripped of his career, his income, and his political influence, he faced what most would consider complete destruction. Yet as he sat in his cell, reflecting on the sudden reversal of his fortunes, Machiavelli experienced something unexpected, a profound sense of liberation. The external trappings of power and position that he had spent years accumulating were gone, but the internal transformation he had undergone remained intact. The psychological sovereignty he had developed through years of disciplined practice could not be taken from him by political enemies or changed circumstances. This realization led him to the deepest insights of his philosophy. The ultimate test of the principles he had developed was not whether they could help one acquire and maintain external power, but whether they could sustain one even when that power was lost. The man who had truly destroyed his weak self, who had eliminated his dependence on external validation and approval, who had achieved genuine psychological self-sufficiency, such a man could not be destroyed by others because the only self that remained was indestructible. During the long months of forced retirement that followed his release from prison, Machiavelli had ample opportunity to observe how different individuals responded to adversity and loss. Some, who had appeared strong and confident during their periods of success, crumbled when their external supports were removed. They became bitter, desperate, or depression, unable to function without the validation and resources that had previously sustained them. Others, however, seemed to grow stronger in the face of adversity, as if external pressure had revealed reserves of inner strength they had not known they possessed. The difference, Machiavelli realized, lay not in their external circumstances but in the degree to which they had achieved true psychological independence. Those who collapsed under pressure had been dependent on external sources of validation, meaning, and identity. When these were removed, they had nothing left. Those who thrived despite adversity had learned to generate these things internally. Their sense of worth, purpose, and identity was not contingent on others' recognition or approval. This insight led Machiavelli to formulate what he would consider his most important contribution to understanding human nature, the concept of the sovereign self. The sovereign self was not merely independent of others' opinions or approval, though it included these qualities. It was a condition of complete psychological autonomy in which one's sense of worth, meaning, and purpose was entirely self-generated and self-sustaining. The development of such sovereignty required more than the elimination of supplicant behaviors like chasing, begging, and explaining. It required a fundamental reorientation of one's relationship to all external circumstances, including success and failure, praise and criticism, acceptance and rejection. The truly sovereign self remained equally balanced regardless of which of these it encountered, because its equilibrium was not dependent on any of them. This was perhaps the most difficult aspect of the transformation to achieve, because it went against some of humanity's deepest instincts. People naturally felt elated by success and deflated by failure, energized by praise and wounded by criticism, validated by acceptance and diminished by rejection. These responses appeared to be hardwired into human nature, developed over millennia of evolution in social environments where group approval could mean the difference between survival and death. But Machiavelli had observed that in the complex political and social environments of his time, these natural responses had become sources of vulnerability rather than strength. The person who was elated by success became overconfident and careless. The person who was wounded by criticism became defensive and reactive. The person who was energized by praise became dependent on it and, therefore, vulnerable to its withdrawal. Conversely, those who had learned to maintain their equilibrium regardless of external circumstances possessed tremendous advantages. They could think clearly and strategically even under pressure because their judgment was not clouded by emotional reactions. They could take calculated risks because they were not paralyzed by fear of failure or criticism. They could persist through setbacks because their motivation was internal rather than dependent on external encouragement or recognition. The cultivation of this sovereign indifference required sophisticated mental disciplines. It was not enough simply to suppress emotional reactions or pretend indifference while remaining internally reactive. True sovereignty required a deep acceptance of the fundamental uncertainty and impermanence of all external circumstances. Success and failure, praise and criticism, acceptance and rejection were all temporary conditions that said nothing essential about one's worth or identity. This acceptance was not fatalistic resignation but, rather, a form of profound realism about the nature of human existence. External circumstances were largely beyond one's direct control, influenced by countless factors including luck, timing, and others' decisions. To base one's sense of worth or emotional stability on such variables was to voluntarily surrender one's power to forces beyond one's influence. The alternative was to focus entirely on those elements that were within one's control, one's choices, responses, effort, and internal state. The sovereign self took responsibility for these things absolutely while remaining indifferent to outcomes that depended on factors beyond its influence. This created a kind of invulnerable core that remained stable regardless of external turbulence. Machiavelli tested these principles rigorously during his years of exile and marginalization. He found that he could write with greater clarity and insight when he was not concerned about how his ideas would be received. He could form more authentic relationships when he was not trying to impress others or gain their approval. He could pursue his interests more effectively when he was not distracted by the need to manage others' perceptions or reactions. Most importantly, he discovered that this internal sovereignty actually made him more influential, not less. People were naturally drawn to those who appeared complete and self-sufficient. They respected those who were not easily manipulated or controlled. They valued the opinions of those who seemed indifferent to whether their opinions were accepted or rejected. This paradox, that caring less about others' responses actually made one more influential, was one of the most counterintuitive aspects of Machiavelli's philosophy. It challenged the conventional wisdom that success required constant attention to others' needs, preferences, and reactions. Instead, it suggested that true influence came from developing such complete self-sufficiency that others were naturally drawn to one's stability and strength. The sovereign self was not cold or indifferent to human suffering, nor was it lacking in empathy or compassion. Rather, it was able to offer these qualities from a position of strength rather than need. It could genuinely care about others without being dependent on their reciprocation. It could offer help and support without requiring gratitude or recognition. It could engage fully in relationships while remaining fundamentally self-contained. This quality of engaged detachment, caring deeply while remaining psychologically independent, was perhaps the highest expression of human development that Machiavelli could imagine. It combined the warmth and connection that made life meaningful with the strength and independence that made one truly free. It offered the possibility of relationships based on choice rather than need, of influence based on respect rather than manipulation, of power based on inner strength rather than external control. As Machiavelli refined his understanding of these principles, he began to see their application in every sphere of human activity. In politics, the sovereign leader could make decisions based on genuine assessment of what served the common good rather than what would be popular or personally advantageous. In business, the sovereign negotiator could focus on creating genuine value rather than trying to manipulate others into unfavorable agreements. In personal relationships, the sovereign individual could offer authentic love and friendship without the neediness that often corrupted such connections. The development of such sovereignty was not a destination but a continuous practice. Even those who had achieved considerable psychological independence could find their old patterns of dependence and reactivity emerging under sufficient stress. The discipline required constant vigilance and renewal, but the rewards grew more substantial over time. The sovereign self possessed what Machiavelli came to think of as anti-fragility, the quality of growing stronger under stress rather than being weakened by it. Criticism sharpened its thinking rather than wounding its ego. Setbacks clarified its priorities rather than devastating its morale. Rejection freed it to focus on more worthy pursuits rather than leaving it desperate for acceptance. This anti-fragility was perhaps the clearest sign that one had truly destroyed the weak self. The weak self was fragile, dependent on favorable circumstances for its well-being. It was diminished by criticism, devastated by failure, and desperate for approval. The sovereign self, by contrast, was strengthened by adversity, clarified by criticism, and indifferent to others' approval or disapproval. In his final years, as Machiavelli observed the continued political turmoil in Italy and reflected on the principles he had developed through decades of experience, he recognized that the creation of the sovereign self was perhaps the most important work any individual could undertake. It was not merely a path to personal success or happiness, though it often led to both. It was the foundation of all genuine freedom, strength, and influence. The man who had destroyed his weak self, who had eliminated his dependence on external validation, his compulsion to explain and justify himself, and his need for others' approval, had achieved something that could not be taken away by any external force. He had created an inviolable core of selfhood that remained stable regardless of circumstances. He had become truly sovereign, not over others, but over himself. Such sovereignty was not granted by birth or position but earned through discipline, practice, and psychological development. It was available to anyone willing to undertake the difficult work of transformation, regardless of their external circumstances. It offered the possibility of genuine freedom in a world where most people remained enslaved by their need for others' approval and understanding. The sovereign self represented the highest achievement of human development, the creation of an individual who could not be destroyed by others because there was nothing in them left to destroy. All weakness had been burned away in the forge of experience and discipline. What remained was pure strength, not the brittle strength of domination over others, but the flexible strength of complete mastery over oneself. This mastery was the ultimate form of power because it was the only form that could not be taken away. Kingdoms could be lost, wealth could be stolen, reputations could be destroyed, but the sovereign self remained untouchable. It was the fortress that could never be breached, the treasure that could never be stolen, the freedom that could never be revoked. In achieving such sovereignty, one did not become invulnerable to external harm. The sovereign self could still suffer physical pain, material loss, or emotional grief. But it could not be psychologically broken or fundamentally diminished. Its core remained intact regardless of what happened around it or to it. This was the true meaning of Machiavelli's insight that the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, not that he becomes immune to all harm, but that he becomes immune to the only kind of harm that truly matters, the destruction of his essential self. The path to such sovereignty was available to all, but taken by few. It required the courage to face one's own weaknesses honestly, the discipline to practice new behaviors consistently, and the patience to allow transformation to occur gradually over time. But, for those willing to undertake this journey, it offered the greatest reward imaginable, the achievement of genuine human freedom and the development of unshakable inner strength. In this way, Machiavelli's philosophy transcended the merely practical concerns of political success or social influence. It offered a vision of human potential that was both inspiring and achievable, the possibility of becoming truly sovereign, truly free, and truly indestructible, not through domination of others, but through complete mastery of oneself. The weak self, with all its needs and dependencies, could indeed be destroyed, but from its ashes would arise something far more powerful and enduring, the sovereign self, autonomous and indestructible, the master of its own destiny and the architect of its own strength.